mynews.studio.
A sea of solar panels now outshines coal in China. Could this signal a global turning point?
Today is February 18th, 2026. China has just reported a 0.3% decline in CO2 emissions for 2025, making this the second year in a row with either stable or falling emissions. That's notable because China is the world's largest carbon emitter. The real question is, what actually drove this change?
It really comes down to scale. In 2025 alone, China added 315 gigawatts of solar and 119 gigawatts of wind capacity. If you add that together, it's more than 430 gigawatts of new renewables. That pushed total solar to 1.2 terawatts and wind to 0.64 terawatts. And it's not just about electricity generation. This expansion directly led to a 1.9% drop in coal-fired generation.
So, renewables are actually meeting new electricity demand, not just replacing old coal, right? And I'm wondering, does that change emissions outside the power sector, like in transport or buildings?
Exactly. Renewables now make up 60.4% of China's total electricity capacity. That cleaner grid is supplying transport, so electric vehicles, for example, and buildings. That means emissions in those sectors are also dropping. Construction, which uses a lot of energy, is benefiting from the grid's lower carbon footprint. But not every sector is seeing declines.
Chemicals, for instance, saw emissions rise by 12% because they're still reliant on coal and fossil feedstocks. What's holding chemicals and heavy industry back? Is it technical barriers, economic reasons, or something else?
It's mostly technical and economic. The chemical sector and heavy industry are harder to electrify and decarbonize. They use coal not just for energy, but as a raw material. That's why China's upcoming 15th five-year plan, expected soon, is so important. It should include policies to cap coal use, speed up the phase-down of fossil energy, and push for more aggressive grid reforms.
Are there any new technologies being tried out for these harder-to-abate sectors?
Concentrated solar power, or CSP, is being considered because it can provide baseload storage. In other words, it can help keep the grid stable even when the sun isn't shining. That's a step toward making renewables more useful for industry.
China's targets for 2035 are pretty clear. A 7 to 10% net greenhouse gas cut from peak levels, and over 30% of energy from non-fossil sources. How does that compare with progress in the US, India, or Europe?
China's additions are much larger than other countries. In 2025, the US added about 60 gigawatts of renewables. That's about a seventh of China's total. India is increasing solar, but still on a smaller scale. The EU is making steady progress, especially with the Green Deal. But China's pace is prompting everyone to rethink their own timelines.
So, does this mean China is ahead of its Paris Agreement commitments, and does that put pressure on other countries to speed up their climate plans?
Yes, China's wind and solar growth has already surpassed its 2030 nationally determined contribution targets. That does increase the pressure on everyone else, especially since China's trajectory affects the entire global climate budget.
But there are still risks. China is still approving new coal plants, and the pace of phasing down coal isn't matching what some experts are hoping for. Could that slow or even reverse the progress?
That's the key question. Declines in emissions driven by technology are much more sustainable than those due to economic slowdowns. But if coal approvals continue, that could undermine the gains. The next few years will really show if China can keep up this pace while tackling its hardest to decarbonize sectors.
If China manages to separate emissions from economic growth, could this approach work for other developing economies too?
It's possible. The main takeaway is that large-scale investment in renewables, combined with policy support, can bend the emissions curve. But the job isn't done, especially in chemicals, heavy industry, and coal.
China's story is now at the center of global climate efforts. It shows both the potential and the limits of rapid clean energy growth.
To sum up, China's emissions have dropped for the second year, driven by record clean energy investment. The power sector is decarbonizing, but challenges remain in industry and coal. The world is watching to see whether this marks the start of a long-term global shift.
Thanks for joining us as we unpack the numbers, the technologies, and the policy shifts shaping China's emissions story.
Thank you for listening. This episode was powered by mynews.studio. Try it now for free.